So now we're going to hear from the people actually doing the doing, if you like, restoration in action. And just before we do that, I want to give a plug out to John. There's an artist in the room, you might have seen him. He's doing some like caricatures of the different speakers and people during conversations. And he's absolutely brilliant, and he's got that on display downstairs. So please, if you do get time when you're having lunch after, go and have a look, because it's really brilliant what he's done, and it just lightens it all a little bit, I think, as well. So we've got 5 speakers today. We're starting with Richard Unsworth from Project Seagrass, followed by Amelia Newman, Ocean Conservation Trust, Maria Hayden-Hughes, Bangor University, Wild Oysters Project, James Maclean, the Land and Water Group, Will Manning, Environment Agency, all taking us through different projects that they're involved with, actually restoration in action. So, Richard.
Good morning. Thank you very much for having me today. It's great to be here. And great to be here, and it's a really wonderful conference to see so many people involved with restoration from different angles, and to see how this community has grown in sort of different approaches and different academic fields over the last decade, because that's really what I'm talking about today, giving you a whistle-stop tour of experiments that we've done in seagrass restoration alongside the projects that we've been running over the last decade. And all that work is basically, it's indebted not just to my team and my great colleagues, but also the funders, the partners. You know, there's been a lot of great discussion about partnerships, and none of this work could have happened without those partnerships on the ground. So back in 2010, when we started rethinking about restoration of seagrasses, there was very limited history of seagrass restoration happening in the UK. There's been a paper published in the Suffolk, Norfolk areas back in the early 1970s, but no one had really built upon that work. We're aware that there's some wildfowlers in Chichester Harbour in the 1930s that did some restoration, but we don't really know how that went. But fast forward, since that point, there's been a huge uptake in interest in seagrass restoration. And that means we've got projects all around the country, and in many of those locations, there's multiple partners, multiple projects happening, and it's a really exciting time for seagrass restoration. But I really want to share the lessons that we've learned that helps us push that work forward to a whole new level. And I think starting at the collection of seagrass propagules, any restoration project needs some sort of living material to make it happen. You've got to collect that from somewhere. And we've been doing a lot of work collecting both seagrass shoots and seagrass cores. And what we're finding is that however we do that, whether we're collecting it by hand, whether we're using some sort of lawnmower approach, whether we're using cores, it doesn't actually damage the seagrass. Obviously, we're doing it in a controlled and careful manner, and we're following clear criteria about that, but we're not actually damaging seagrass. Taking seagrass shoots doesn't cause a long-term impact on the seagrass, and this aligns with work that's been done all around the world. When we start a project, we need to make decisions about where we'll do that and what is the appropriate site for that restoration. The conventional way to do that is to think about habitat suitability modelling. And 5 years ago, I would have told you that's the way to go. Now I'm a bit more doubtful about that. And what we're discovering is that habitat suitability modelling, however well you build it, is a useful directional tool into where you might focus your efforts, but it doesn't give you the answers. And a great example of this is work we did as part of a HLF project in North Wales, where we planted seagrass in 6 sites. 4 of those failed. 1 was only a partial success. So be careful what you believe in a model, and it's definitely not a silver bullet habitat suitability modelling. Aligned to the sort of global literature on seagrass restoration, what we know is that scale matters. So doing tiny little individual small plots of seagrass restoration is unlikely to be successful. I saw a recent presentation by the Vice President of the World Seagrass Association, Emma Jackson, and she was talking about how if you're going to do restoration, you need to do it big. You need to do it really big. I think she used an explicit word in that description, but I think it highlights the point that you don't do it in small scales. And that scale concept matters at small levels as well as large scales, because you need to think about how you do it, and you need to create lots of small resilient pockets of seagrass over a large area rather than spreading your effort too thin. And that's what various different experiments that we've done have shown. When we started having troubles with some of our seagrass restoration plots, when things weren't working, we thought we could look at the literature and find examples of lots of failure of seagrass restoration. We could learn from it. And then we thought, we can't find that. Let's look at the oysters. Let's look at the saltmarsh. Let's look at the reefs. Let's look at the mangroves. The restoration community has a problem with failure. We don't report it. It's not exciting to report. It's not exciting to explain. But in order to progress restoration, the only way we're going to do that is to report failure properly. And we need to wear it as a badge of honour in restoration and be proud that actually we're learning from it rather than hiding it away and burying it in a cupboard. And when you begin to look at failure, you can begin to understand things such as feedbacks. And feedbacks are something that we've experienced in our restoration wherever we go. They're a pain in the neck. They seem to appear from every angle. Whether that's green crabs munching at seagrass seeds that are just buried into the sediment, or whether it's kelp being washed into a bay and sitting on top of a restoration project. What we're finding is that those things can be sometimes difficult to predict and even harder to control. So there's lots of learning in that space that we need to think about, and we need to adapt our restoration to deal with those problems. Unfortunately, we remain the dirty man of Europe, and I think that line was awarded to us in the 1980s or 1990s, but I think it would be unfair to have taken that away. Unfortunately, our seagrasses around the UK are being hammered by poor water quality. They're hugely elevated in nitrates. Phosphates are also pretty high, and those levels are well above global averages. And what we see is that when we get higher levels of tissue nitrogen in our seagrass, we get less dense meadows. It's a very clear relationship, and it links to work that's been done in other parts of the world. But although we experience water that is awash with nutrients, what we find in some of our projects is that those nutrients aren't always in the right place. And actually, seagrasses tend to preferentially want to utilise ammonium rather than taking nitrate out of the water. So they want to get that ammonium from the pore water in the sediment. And often, even when places like the Milford Haven waterway, where nitrates are sky high, when we actually add Osmocote into the sediments, then it actually increases our success rates. So just thinking about the one angle of water quality is never quite enough to predict the success of a project. I'm a bit obsessed with sport, and I've admired the concept of marginal gains in Sky cycling team, in the English rugby team, and I think this concept applies very much to restoration, because restoration is made up of many, many different tasks, and to improve that restoration, it's not just thinking about getting better at one particular task. It's about improving all of those tasks along the way. And here's a couple of examples of looking at timing, looking at the substrate that we use. They matter and they influence the success of our restoration. Engagement is also critical, engaging with the right people. And in West Wales, where we've run our most successful project to date, our early success of restoration was hammered because a rogue fisherman destroyed that seagrass. And that was because we'd engaged with everyone else, but we'd missed a particular fisher. And it's a dangerous game to miss key stakeholders. Seagrass restoration is difficult, and I'm not going to hide from that case. But this video shows that it is possible and it is working. These are areas that we planted in Dale in West Wales, areas that were lifeless and now are thick with abundant seagrass that's reproducing naturally, and it's a fantastic habitat for animal life. So, and I just wanted to finish with this last point, that the more I've dug into seagrass restoration, I feel like the less I really understand. It's a difficult process. It's not easy, and but I think if you follow the science, then you'll get there in the end. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. I didn't realise how horrible that is to stand up when someone's finishing a presentation. Sorry. I love I like the marginal gains concept as well. That was really good. Amelia, you're up next. Thanks.
Good morning. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for Duncan yesterday for introducing this project already. So I'm going to talk about ReMEDIES over the last 4 years. Just a reminder for those who weren't quite awake yesterday, this is a 4-year EU-funded project, which is just about to come to the end. So some of the key aims, we were looking at protection and engagement, but I'm largely going to talk about the restoration effort that we have done. The project works across 5 different sites along the south coast, including Essex up there in the corner, but the restoration work is only in Jennycliff Bay in Plymouth and just outside the Bewley River in the Solent Maritime. So what have we been up to? We also tried the bag method, so sticking seeds in the bags. We've also had a new injection method, and we've done seed mat technology. Starting in 2020, this is our timeline of what we've been up to, but key date coming up in the future, which I'll point out at the end. Starting in 2020 was when we began with the seed bag method. We've aimed to restore 3.4 hectares with the bags. It was not an easy task. We went through huge amounts of volunteers. There was an amazing amount of volunteers. We had a huge amount of poor weather. And that wasn't just poor weather deploying it. You might recognize that face. But also the poor weather resulted in a majority of our bags being lost or no germination at all. So in the Solent, we put out 1 hectare, it's 20,000 bags. We found 2 on the seabed and several were washed up. In Jennycliff Bay, we saw that 5% germination, but it's basically the end was that it's not a viable restoration method. So we carried on, we didn't stop there, kept going, and that's when we started to work on our seed mat technology. It's called that because it's a 3-layer process of cotton, hessian, coir matting, and then there's a layer of horticulturally sterilised sand, of which we hand select 100 seeds to go in. So we're checking the viability before they go in. This is an incredible way of growing plants, but it does require the very unique system we have at the aquarium. So based within the National Marine Aquarium, we have very filtered water, we have an incredible light system, and so this is able to create 100 of these seed mat technologies that we're then able to deploy into the local area. An important note is that they can only go into the local Jennycliff Bay. Transporting them is actually quite difficult. These photos show that we've start with 100 seeds. Not all of them germinate, but we have increased that germination rate from about 20% when we started in 2021 through to now. This round is about 45% on average. So really increasing what we can do in our nursery grounds. And then they get to adult plants and we prepare them for deployment. This just quick overview of what we're collecting in that lab, and it gives us an idea of when we can start putting them out once they're actually adult plants, but we get quite a nice canopy variation. We don't deploy on minimal, we go big. This is 100 of those mats all at once onto the seabeds, and it is a huge 2-day task to get them in to the ground. Once they're in, we have several that are monitored so we can keep going back and we can continue to collect the same data that we were collecting in the lab, and to have a look at how well our restoration is working out. They are pretty much well established. We have a lot of those mats that are completely incorporated into the into the surrounding area, with sedimentation around the mats, as well as root structures and rhizomes being formed on the mats and around, to the point where they actually prefer to be in the surrounding sediment. There's a lot of growth off these mats, and that's not a negative thing. They're clearly finding an environment that they prefer to be in, which is the mats degrade within 12 months. We're seeing them breaking up, so it's just good to see a new ecosystem. So we continue to work on our seed injection method, our broadcasting, because although those mats are useful, they produce plants, and adult plants going into the environment is good, but it doesn't really cover a large area. We can put out 100, and that's only 0.33 of a hectare. We had an 8-hectare target. It was going to take us a long time if we just did it with the mats. So we continue to work on our injection method, which we're calling the HMS octopus, as it's a hydromarine seeding octopus, incorporates OCT, pressurized underwater seeder. So it looks like this, and it's a mixture of agar seed and sand, and it's taken us a while to get to the point of what that mixture should be, mainly because we had issues with the nozzle getting clogged up, the amount that you can do in a dive. So these divers go in, they do 200-meter lines, and they're injecting every meter. When they're injecting, they're putting in about 5 to 10 seeds per injection, which means we can cover a hectare in a day. The boat operations for just 6 of these octopus units is massive, and if you was to scale that into just 10, you'd need several deckhands. There's a lot of mess, there's a lot of sand that's required, but it is possible, and getting past that 1 hectare a day is definitely achievable. So this is the site in Jennycliff Bay. I'm just going to stick with Jennycliff rather than the Solent as well, because this is where we had all 3 methods tried. You can see the different lines on the far corner. I'm not sure which side it is, sorry, that where we put the mats in, and there's a few different methods there because we've also put in blank mats, so we're trying to look at whether it's sedimentation, increase of seed, that also helps with the restoration. And then 2021 also had a different method, so that's why there's different colours, and then the HMS site is where we did the injection. These are the results from a preliminary monitoring that we went out and did very recently, and you can see that there is an increase of plants in and around the 2022 mats, the original ones, as well as where we did the injection method. It's important to note that there's not plants everywhere. The injection is relatively new, but those mats that we put in first have shown real success. This is actually the restoration site. So where the 2022 plants were starting to come off the mats, they have now created their own ecosystem. We're seeing an increase in biodiversity, but that is something that's not being monitored. The site is also producing its own seeds. So we have seen seeds slightly earlier, but there are an increase of seed in the area that we previously were not seeing plants, let alone seed production. Still to come, we will continue to look at where we put out the mats, and we have another ½ hectare of injection to do. And once that's done, we have hit our 8 hectares of targeted restoration with the seeds and the mats. But we also have best practice guides coming out. So for ReMEDIES, we've written a methodology on how we've done the cultivation, as well as a final report on everything that ReMEDIES has done and has achieved. And then finally, our best practice guide, our suggestions of how to do this again. But importantly, we have an end-of-life conference, which is not depressing, it is life-funded, so it is, and that's happening on the 1st of October. So if you'd like to come along, please let us know. And all of this work is going to continue into Blue Meadows, which is run by the Ocean Conservation Trust as well. Thank you very much for listening.
Okay, so I'd now like to introduce Maria Hayden-Hughes from Bangor University, who works with the Wild Oysters Project.
Hello. Pnawn Bawb, I think it is afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Maria Hayden-Hughes. I'm a research lead for the Wild Oysters Project based in Conwy Bay in North Wales. And today I'll be presenting on charting the progress through early monitoring results and future scaling. In my presentation, I'll introduce the Wild Oysters Project, speak about our early monitoring results collected through citizen science, and some of our restoration activities this last summer as well. So, the Wild Oysters Project. So it was a national collaboration between the Zoological Society of London, ZSL, Blue Marine Foundation, both based in London, and also British Marine. The project was funded by the People's Postcode Lottery for 3 years, from 2020 to the end of 2023. We have set up restoration hubs in northeast England, in Tyneside, partnering with Groundwork, northeast in Cumbria, and also in North Wales in Conwy Bay, partnering with Bangor University. So our key activities have been to develop and deliver oyster nurseries set up in 2 marina locations in each hub, and this is sort of following on from work carried out in the Solent by University of Portsmouth and Blue Marine Foundation. We also plan to deliver seabed restoration, and that was sort of building on sort of experiences by Inori, so the Essex Native Oyster Restoration Initiative in Essex, and also to create an outreach and engagement programme, which Joe and Ray presented yesterday in the poster session. So yeah, we've been working with key local representatives from industry, businesses, regulators, and also the community via our local working group to really drive the development of the project in those local sites. But yeah, I'm definitely sharing this presentation on behalf of the wider team. So as part of our outreach and education, we've been carrying out monthly monitoring of our oyster nurseries at our 4 marina sites, split between the 2 hubs, for the past 3 years. So yeah, come rain, come shine. We've had the dedicated support of over 500 local citizen scientists across the sites, dedicating nearly 5,000 volunteering hours, and we've hosted 9 university student research projects as well. This table shows a summary of our monitoring plan. I'm not going to run through it all, but just to summarise, we've collected data about the associated biodiversity, oyster mortality, reproduction, and then also environmental data as well. So over the next few slides, I'll be sharing a small snapshot of the oyster nursery data, which was included in a report by Blue Marine Foundation. So we found that the oysters housed in our nurseries displayed clear growth from shell measurement data, as you can see in figure 1. We had high survival rates with an average annual survival of 78% in both the North East and the Welsh site. We experienced highest oyster mortality rates in the summer months, which correlated with the oyster spawning season, as you can see in figure 2. So this shows for Conwy Marina, the percentage of oyster mortality over time, so the black line, and then the blue bars are the number of oysters brooding larvae during the summer. So yeah, just to note, we didn't do larval monitoring during the first year in 2021. And these larval samples were processed and analysed at Bangor University and also the University of Portsmouth as well. And then also we've estimated that across both hubs, currently about nearly 150 million litres of water, so the equivalent to 60 Olympic-sized swimming pools, have been filtered by our oysters. Our mobile biodiversity netting of our oyster nurseries saw us record 86 different species. The most common taxa were amphipods, shrimps, shore crabs, and these images display some of the species that we've recorded. Interestingly, we had 84 sightings of the critically endangered European eel inside our oyster nurseries. Diversity varied seasonally, with the highest diversity observed during the summer months. Groundwork conducted analysis for sessile biodiversity on the shells of the oysters, and this was dominated by barnacles, keelworms, sea squirts, blue mussel and hydroids. We also found that the dorsal side of the shell had the highest abundance and richness of epifauna than compared with the ventral side. So in the next few slides, I'm going to summarise our restoration activities last summer, following the completion of scoping surveys, local consultation, and being awarded our marine licences. So to start with, at our Tyneside site, we have created an oyster reef, 75 metres by 100 metres in size. And to do that, we started with the deployment of over 750 tonnes of culch. This was made up of local limestone, gravel, and also weathered scallop. So these calcareous materials are used in oyster reef restoration to support natural recruitment of native flat oyster. And this was done by deploying the material off a 45-metre dredger using an excavator arm with a large grab bucket to allow scattering over the water surface. And this created an oyster reef approximately the size of a football pitch. So yeah, following the deployment, we deployed 10,000 mature native oysters on top of the culture material. But before that, they were cleaned as a biosecurity measure by a dedicated team of 100 volunteers. And we also stored those oysters during this time in the local fish quay. When ready, the oysters were deployed in a 25-metre square box in the middle of the reef at a density of 16 oysters per metre squared to account for possible low retention rates. So yeah, the team is currently busy conducting bathymetry and benthic habitat surveys to assess reef height, footprint and species composition a year on since this work was carried out. So yeah, we look forward to analysing those results and sharing those with you. At our Conway Bay site, we were also aiming to deliver a similar size reef. We started with the deployment of 650 tonnes of local limestone last June. We used local stone bagged into 1-tonne dumpy bags, and these were deployed from a multi-purpose landing craft. This vessel was used just because of vessel availability in the area, and also to be within the project budget as well. Unfortunately, this method did not achieve a uniform spread, which has led to unforeseen delays, but we hope that this year, to complete our reef with the deployment of 200 tonnes of weathered scallop shell and cooked cockle shell, followed by our oysters, and continue seabed monitoring as well. So our key sort of project learnings was that identifying locations to store large volumes of culture material can be really challenging. The costs and time should not be underestimated. Mobilising movements of large volumes of culture material is challenging. You've got to align with weather windows, boat availability, hauliers, and yeah, I definitely felt sometimes I was a bit underqualified for all that logistical planning. So yeah, definitely planning in sort of contingency time for identifying, acquiring vessels, selecting sites, or even areas with larger fleets that will definitely help projects remedy this in the future. Marine licensing, as has been pointed out, is yet very expensive, time-consuming to acquire. Restoration activities as well are weather-dependent and seasonal, so yeah, you've got to definitely factor in additional time and budget into project timelines to account for possible delays. Also incorporating seabed levelling activities in the marine licence application for oyster restoration to avoid needing sort of further down the line licence variations or a new marine licence. We found that our quarterly local working group meetings, having those since the start, been really beneficial and vitally important. We definitely recommend holding these meetings in a variety of formats to increase accessibility and also involvement in the project, ensuring that all those interested are involved, informed, and have the opportunity to also provide feedback. Using local vessels and facilities for deployment activities was also extremely useful in raising project awareness. Involving the fishers into the planning provides invaluable insights. Engagement should be ongoing, so really continue to build those networks, and also adapting engagement strategies as well, so face-to-face on the ground, quayside conversations has been really useful, and also if the opportunity arises, partnering with fishers and to deliver project activities and reimbursing them for the cost of their time and boat time as well accordingly. Also, the oyster nursery method is a really effective engagement tool. However, maintenance and monitoring is quite time consuming and labour intensive. So yeah, sort of building that into project development as well. So finally, we wanted to just touch on our legacy projects and funding. So we were awarded £420,000 as part of the Stronger Shores partnership led by South Tyneside Council with funding from UK Government FCRIP. This funding is for 3 years at the Tyne and Wear site, and we were also awarded a combined £500,000 by the Nature Network Fund for 3 years to continue the Conway Bay site and also plan for potential seascape recovery as well within the Menai Strait and Conway Bay SAC. So I'll just leave it like that. But to conclude, yeah, thank you very much, diolch yn fawr iawn. And yeah, definitely the strength of the collaboration has really been demonstrated by the restoration activities that we've achieved and also the legacy that this is built on. But thank you very much.
Okay. Thanks, Maria. So now over to James Maclean from the Land and Water Group. I'm looking forward to this. You'll find out why.
Good morning, everybody, and it's delightful to see how many people have turned up just to this great event, and the growing numbers every year just show us how important it is. You'll be really pleased to hear that I'm only doing 4 slides after this one. This is the graveyard shift. I really appreciate that. So just to make sure we've got our blood flowing, I'm going to invite you to play a game with me because I'm going to give you one big ticket number to take away today. So because time is tight, I'm going to ask you to do the following quickly and quietly. Can everybody please stand up? Okay, so the schoolmaster lesson today is we dump a huge amount of dredged material around the UK shores and in our deep water environments every single year. How much is that number? And there are some people in the room, ABP and the Beneficial Working Group, who know that number, but not everybody does. So we're going to play a game. We're going to work out in the last 3 years how much material we have wasted, because this is not a waste, it is a resource. And we're going to use it for saltmarsh restoration. So I'm going to start the bidding, and I'm going to invite you to sit down when I say a number that you think we dump. This is for 3 years. I'm going to start at 30 million tonnes. Okay, I'll go straight to 40 million tonnes dumped in the UK waters every year. 50 million tonnes. Sit down when you think I've said the number. The contractor says it's the heavy stuff. Okay, 60 million tonnes in 3 years. 65 million tonnes. Okay, the answer to the clever people standing up is in the last 3 years, we have dumped 67 million tonnes of dredged material around the UK. Now, please remember that number. Please remember that number. That is the equivalent every year of 5 full Wembley stadiums to the roof. Think about that in terms of volume, you football fans. So, before I go on, I want to quickly say some thank yous about the 2 projects I'm going to talk about. Chichester Harbour Conservancy, in particular Sarah Chatfield, for supporting us and allowing us to break some eggs to create some omelettes. And we're going to talk, I was delighted actually yesterday with the kind of let's have a go, because we're going to pick up on let's have a go. And we're about to start at Lymington, and I'm going to talk about that in 2 weeks' time. So thank you, Lymington Harbour Commissioners, for allowing us to make even bigger omelettes and even bigger eggs to break in the process. And Joe Ratcliffe and Environment Agency and Blue Marine Foundation for their co-funding, and the regulators who have worked with us to allow us to crack some eggs inside SSIs and Ramsars. And I'm going to remind myself of a conversation I had with a Natural England officer 3 years ago when we started the journey with Chichester, where the phrase came back over Teams, because it was back in COVID, there's no way you can have an impact inside my SSI. And I reminded that individual that if we did nothing, there wasn't going to be a SSI. And so some impact in a measured and responsible way might be essential to get to a bigger value. So the Land and Water Group, we are environmental engineers. We run about 30 projects of restoration. We are regenerative, so we take on projects that leave the planet better than when we found it. That is beyond sustainable and into regeneration. And Earth Change is a division of ours that's been looking at how we're going to trade credits and build habitats to trade those credits, and Tom Godfrey's here with me today. So we have a go mentality. We love to innovate. We are not reckless. So we engage and we challenge in equal proportion. And we're very ambitious. And I'm going to take a quote from Einstein, who says, insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different value. So I ask, why are we putting 67 million tonnes of a resource in the wrong location, a nutrient-rich organic material from our estuaries, and putting it in a low-nutrient environment on the seabed? It's called contamination. So the hypothesis is to try and use that material beneficially to help with climate resilience, sea level rise, carbon, nutrient, all the other mitigations. Use this as a resource. And we want to build back by building out, as well as, in some cases, manage realignment. There is a marriage here. But in areas where we have measured, quantified salt marsh loss, let's rebuild it using this material. And of course, by the way, because somebody put their hand up at the end of the Working in the Wet conference when I did this speech, and they said, but some of it might wash away. And the answer is precisely. Because losing sediment into the estuarial cell is a totally natural process. So get used to the fact that the outer edge might be a dynamic environment. That's okay. Civil engineers, one of them put his hands up at the end of the conference and said, can't you just build a wall around it? Okay, so at Itchenor, I'm going to look at the far picture. So it's difficult to make these lines out, but in Itchenor, they have lost a colossal amount of salt marsh. So since 1956, the losses are 59%. That's 252 hectares. And the continued rate of loss is 2.5 hectares per annum. That's 17 times the footprint of this room every year. So we shouldn't be waiting. We should be trying to change that. And we have a negative eutrophic feedback loop, which is driven by a very, very high nutrient load. So the loss is 8 hectares. And in 2023, we did the first full-scale trial of 2,000 square meters of restoration. And I'm delighted that the samphire in the second picture popped up. We placed the sediment in March. That samphire picture was taken by August. The amazing thing was the locals in Chichester had heard because we'd engaged, and some of them came down with their scissors and took the samphire home and ate it. True, it's true. What we learnt from Itchenor, and I'm going to talk about the method, is we get shrinkage, 300 millimeters. We allowed for 100, we should have allowed for 300, so we've got a little bit of topping up or some learning to do because the material sinks. We got samphire in year 1, pioneer species, but we also withstood storm Henk, Isha, Jocelyn and Kathleen without significant loss. And that's really important because the sediment consolidated surprisingly quickly. It took us by storm, literally. And also, in removing the dredge material from the dredger to the habitat, we didn't leave a single cubic metre in the channel. And this is really important because engaging with the boaters in the fraternity, when we said, by the way, we're going to dump some silt on the edge of the navigation, that was an issue that we had to overcome by dialogue and engagement. So how do we do it? The dredger arrives and dumps his material on the edge of the navigation as high up the tidal chart as he can. And then we use a drag box, which we've designed and built and implemented, and that scoops the material and brings it up to the foreshore. Now, the critical thing about the drag box, unlike pumping, is we don't add water, because water creates turbidity. That has an impact. The drag box moves the material at its in situ density. And then we use GPS positioning on amphibious equipment to place the salt marsh at the target height, 200 to 500 millimetres above mean high water springs. And this is it in action at Itchiner. So the pontoon is the anchor for the scoop, and the scoop is sliding up and down the foreshore, across the mudflat, moving the material. It's not digging, it's not penetrating, it is sliding the material with a one-way door, so it scoops the material up and it returns in an empty state. And that allows us critically to break the critical action between the dredging operation and the placing operation. That's very important from a cost point of view for the people who have to do dredging. So the drag box technology works, and it's very scalable. It doesn't fluidize the material. There's a magic speed to winch at. If you go too fast, you introduce fluidization. If you winch at a constant speed, the sediment will move under the water, and it comes out of the water and up onto the foreshore, and it retains its density. It's low impact. There's no discernible impact on the benthic population. And it was instantly adopted by wading birds. In fact, the men used to come back every morning and couldn't believe the footprints in the mud we placed the night before. And because we can break this criticality between dredging and disposal, we can now mitigate the disposal of material offshore. It's more expensive, which is why we have to look at why it's almost zero cost to dispose of offshore, and it costs us £60,000 just to do the background studies to do 1,000 cubic metres in Chichester. There's a massive cost differential. But the good news is that biodiversity net gain, nutrient neutrality, carbon credits, these things can help us tip that balance and bring this back to an economic solution. Really interesting, and we were running the numbers last night. At 3.5 units a hectare, it completely pays for this activity for BNG. We're just about to start at Lymington with a much bigger strategy where there is a bay. And I'm introducing here today the principle of the deponee. So this is a deposited site in a 10-year permit that allows the dredging fraternity to dump whenever it suits them in a licensed site that we can then move in the next appropriate season for environmental mitigation to restore 8 hectares at Lymington. And these trials start in 2 weeks' time because that's when the bird season hits. And it breaks the interdependency with dredging, and it allows us up to 200 hectares of the real loss that's occurred at Lymington since 1946. It all involves strong partnerships, so our thanks to the Crown Estate, Lymington Harbour Commissioners, Hampshire and Isle of Wight Trust, Earth Change, Land and Water, the boaters and the public to help us get to that. And this is a big opportunity. The principle of a deponee can be applied anywhere if we apply for the right licenses and we engage early enough. And we make it simple for the port operators to bring us their material. So, the new drivers, last slide, changing legislation, the Environment Bill. We are not destroying mudflats. This is a critical point. We are restoring previously failed salt marsh, and that's critical to get the BNG score. So we've got stacked benefits on our side. Public perception about dumping in the sea has to change, and the great work, the Beneficial Working Group and ABPR are giving us these staggering numbers, 22 million cubic metres last year on average. Surfers Against Sewage, the water company profits versus obligations, these are stacking towards us. And I'm pleased to say the Central European Dredging Association is supporting us to lobby DEFRA to look at this shift and prioritise deponees as opposed to offshore disposal. So we're committed to change, and I'm asking for support from this room. We want to introduce reuse as a default. It's not destroying mudflats, it's rebuilding failed salt marsh, using aerial photography from the war. And thank you.
All right, okay, now we have Will. I think, Will, I can't decide if you've either really annoyed people in ReMeMaRe or they've saved the best till last. Either way, I think we'll find out. So, final presentation, Will.
Thanks, Karen. Yeah, hi everyone. For those who haven't met me, I'm Will Manning. Today I'll be talking to you about the Habitat Compensation and Restoration Programme and the role it's been playing over the last 2 decades in our collective history of managed realignment and estuarine and coastal habitat creation in England. But it started before that, so history started here. This is Northey Island in the Blackwater Estuary in Essex, the first managed realignment in England in 1991, where National Trust created 0.8 hectares. So history is a bit of a theme in my talk, but I also wanted to start with a pretty picture, so there you go. So presentation proper. Flood and coastal risk management is about protecting people, property and infrastructure, and in large parts the coastal designated site network. And the vision set out by the National FCRM strategy, which includes the environment, is this: it's a nation ready for and resilient to flooding and coastal change today, tomorrow and to the year 2100. Shoreline management plans and FCRM strategies, they are what guide FCRM investment and activity, and they provide that planning framework, the management intent, and that strategic oversight for risk management authorities to achieve this vision. The shoreline management plans came in the early 2000s, and born out of that was the Regional Habitat Creation Programme, which was established on that early work in the 1990s. In 2018, it rearranged its acronym a bit to become the HCRP, in part to reflect the wider ambitions of the 25-year Environment Plan. And the HCRP is part of this overall FCRM investment, but it is specifically about delivering intertidal and coastal habitat creation, and historically it is focused on compensation for the predicted loss or deterioration of designated sites as a result of FCRM activity. And this compensation, it's a statutory requirement under the HABS regs, and that has 4 big implications here. So, number 1, FCRM compensation has been the legal driver for a lot of the delivery and a lot of the funding of the many managed realignments that this and its predecessor programme have delivered over the last 2 decades. It means that the HCRP is a critical enabler because it allows FCRM activity to meet its environmental legal obligations. The aim of the HCRP is to maintain the overall integrity and coherence of the designated site network. And finally, compensation is essentially running to stand still against that 90s baseline set by the regulations. So the majority of the intertidal habitat loss that is predicted is account on coastal squeeze, so technical definition on the screen and a bit of a visual to help. But simplistically, it's as sea level rise, intertidal habitats can't migrate inland, they get pinned against an artificial structure, which is your FCRM asset protecting people, and that can, over time, cause the deterioration and eventual loss of intertidal habitat. And the HCRP focuses on these longer-term coastal squeeze losses, and it's described as a strategic delivery programme, because those losses would be much harder and less cost-effective for individual FCRM projects to compensate for. Coastal squeeze itself, because it's to do with sea level rise, it affects habitats on the seaward side of those existing structures. And so intertidal habitats such as saltmarsh and mudflat have traditionally formed what we refer to as primary compensation. That's normally created through a managed realignment, which you've heard about a bit today, and I'll show you some pretty pictures soon. But managed realignment can also cause the loss of other coastal designated sites that currently exist behind those sea walls. And if they are present, then in HCRP refer to those as secondary compensation. And the HCRP delivers both primary and secondary. And legal compliance is dependent upon both being in place in advance of the loss occurring. So that has an implication on the ordering and the timeline over a series of years. In terms of structure, the EAE has both an area and a national role. The accountability for FCRM compensation is at the EA area, and so accordingly we have HCRP area leads. There's a few in the room if they want to stick their hands up. Over there, Lynn and Nick. And they are the ones that own and coordinate the development and delivery of the compensatory pipeline. We have 10 HCRP areas, which includes 3 estuaries, which is the Severn, the Humber and the Thames. Nationally, the HCRP sits in the Coastal Resilience team in FCRM, and my role is partly kind of 2 parts. One is I do whatever I can to support the leads in their delivery, and the other one is to provide strategic oversight and engage with internal and external partners on estuarine and coastal issues that are of relevance to the HCRP moving forward. From a reporting perspective, the EA submits 5-year update progress reports to DEFRA. This is in close collaboration with our partners in Natural England, and these provide the balance sheet of the predicted losses and also delivery over that time frame. The most recent 2023 report shows that overall, the HCRP has successfully kept pace with the projected losses for the strategic plans over Epoch 1s. This is roughly 2005 to 2025. In terms of actual delivery, that's just over 1,600 hectares of intertidal habitat. It's almost 470 hectares of freshwater grazing marsh and almost 300 hectares of other coastal habitats. Many of these will be from schemes that a lot of you will have probably heard about and be recognising in a second, but you may not have understood or been aware of necessarily the FCRM compensation and HCRP backstory and delivery model that I've just been describing. So I have a few of our more famous daughters and sons. We have ReMEDIES, Sussex Coast in 2013, Sturt Marshes in 2014, now managed by WWT. We supported the RSPB-led delivery of Wallasey Island, including Jubilee Marsh here in 2015. And one of the more recent schemes was the Lower Otter Restoration Project, which created 55 hectares of compensatory habitat for losses predicted in the ex-estuary. Regarding the pipeline, one of the ones we're expecting, if you check out Laura's poster downstairs, has already started getting wet, but Skeffling is due to breach later in August. This is on the north bank of the Humber, and that will wrap up Epoch 1, the first 20 years. The next 30 years after that, up to 2055, is Epoch 2, and the leads have a rolling programme and pipeline of projects of compensation that meets that predicted need, with all those schemes at different stages of their development. For Epoch 3, this is the 50 years after that. There is a theoretical pipeline, but as I'm sure you can appreciate, the delivery certainty on those is much lower. That current accounting is also based on the previous loss estimates from a coastal squeeze assessment for all those strategic plans. And if that gets updated because of management intent changes or whatever, then the compensatory pipeline has to adjust accordingly. So there's that element. But we're now moving into Epoch 2. It's been raised a few times, which is great. We've also got this new era of environmental recovery and restoration. And I think one of the big things I've noticed working or moving from the ReMeMaRe team and all this work into the FCRM portfolio is there's a real chance here, I think, for the coastal environmental community, so a lot of those in this room, to work much more closely with the coastal FCRM group that I'm now kind of integrating into, just to achieve those shared outcomes. And one of the main actions that I'd encourage you all to do is, if you haven't already done so, speak to my colleague Rich Clark-Wood, who's sat somewhere. He's got the poster down there. There she is. Thank you, Rich. Get onto Digital SMP Explorer. This is a new tool launched in January. Go and experience the coast, explore it, find your local coastal groups of relevance and engage with them at this key time. So, Graham pinned me to the post on this one, but that's HCRP at the moment and a bit of an insight into some FCRM, but for the context of this final session, I really wanted to flag that early work of the 90s and then highlight the work that the HCRP does, how and why, and its delivery over the 2000s and 2010s. And I think that's doubly important to recognise that history when we start looking forwards and consider this word that's changed or featured a lot recently, which is change. And that's really the 2020s in my mind from all I'm watching. And it's really the next transition of this already 30-plus year long journey that we're all on. And this is following the 25-year Environment Plan, the Environment Act, the National FCRM Strategy, the formation of ReMeMaRe, nature markets and natural capital coming in, all looking forward with increasing focus on going beyond restoration, beyond compensation in the 90s baseline, quite rightly, addressing historical losses, and also supporting coastal adaptation much more in the round and de-siloed. The HCRP compensation model, it has worked successfully, it still works, and it is still on track. But we also recognise that it will likely need to evolve and change itself in the coming years, but it is very well placed to support this transition, given its compensatory mandate and also the last 2 decades of delivery. Some of this will need big decisions, some of that's been mentioned at the conference. We are seeing challenges in the HCRP programme that are much broader than the HCRP. They affect everyone working on environmental recovery of our seascapes. And my big 5 challenges for everyone to consider One, the fundamental challenge of competition for limited space in the coastal strip, which can be made worse if we're not careful by misaligning or creating competing drivers. Number two is pragmatic conversations around adaptation of the designated site network based on future resilience, sustainability, functionality, and naturalness. Costs are going up and they're variable. Understanding the drivers, trends, and beneficiaries is important. Recognition and acceptance that a pipeline of schemes with landowner and community support that can meet the demand we're seeing takes a lot of time and effort. These are not off-the-shelf products. And the need for national strategic oversight of what's delivered where, why, when, and by who, so that we can move forward collaboratively together with a more unified voice and vision. So a few easy ones to tackle there. And whilst those broad challenges are being tackled, we will be included in that, we can support. But there are things that we can do internally and working with others to make sure we are the most effective programme and partner to work with everyone else. So to do so, we've developed this improvement project running to March 26. The aims to create the tools, guidance, data and governance needed to support and improve development, delivery and strategic oversight of the SCRM HCRP. This is to provide compensation legal obligations, but also to support those wider ambitions. So, almost wrapping up, as well as my 5 broad challenges, I wanted to finish with my top 5 wish lists of things for future HCRP delivery that will support this collective ambition. So first and foremost is the simple over-delivery of compensation. So we are contributing to that wider restoration. That's what essentially it means for HCRP. We want to work with Natural England and others in those conversations to develop the agreed approaches to adaptation of the designated site network. In keeping with Caroline's talk yesterday and that great work on natural capital, we are quite a big source of public finance in this space, and I'd like to see HCRP working with partners to develop those blended public-private finance models. I think something around a compensatory core with a restoration halo has merit. Aligning with Joe's talk yesterday on seascapes and the multiple benefits narrative, I want to see us developing multi-habitat seascape approaches to risk management, and I suspect in the early days using these as living labs to get that uplift in our evidence base. And finally, linked to Jonathan Dale's poster downstairs on unmanaged realignment is really thinking about how we might deliver strategically over the longer term, where we start preparing areas at risk now to minimise potential negative impacts or maximise potential environmental benefit through coastal change in the future. So that's my final bit and my final message here. It is an exciting, busy, complicated and transitional moment in both coastal FCRM and environmental recovery. And the take-home message is really consider the HCRP a strategic friend and partner. And as we build on our 20 years of experience and continue to deliver compensatory habitat, we want to work with all of you and put the R in HCRP so we can restore estuarine and coastal habitats moving forward together. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Will. So if I can invite all the speakers back up to the stage for the final Q&A, if that's okay. We're going to wrap this up by 5 to 1. There'll then be Roger back on the stage to finish things off, and then it will be lunch. So if you can hang on in there, the last 20 minutes. Yeah, so if we start with Natasha, just because I saw her hand first, and then we'll move over. That's okay.
Thank you for excellent talks. There's a question to James and Will. Coastal squeeze, Will demonstrated really clearly. And my question is to James. Before we think we've got a really nice solution in using our extra dredged sediment for restoration purposes, it's logical, isn't it, to suggest that do you understand the causes of the saltmarsh degradation in the first place before we start trying to rebuild it, when coastal squeeze is naturally going to be taking it back into the system, which might be a good thing, but is it ever actually going to work in the coastal squeeze scenario?
First of all, I'm not a salt marsh expert. I'm trying to rebuild them, but I think so. There are 2 questions I think in one. First of all, what's causing the degradation? I think that's a combination of sea level rise, high intensity weather events, and frequency and strength, increased boat use, walking. There's a whole myriad of influences on why our salt and eutrophic environments and blinding. There's a whole myriad of influences there. What we're proposing isn't necessarily that they're going to stay forever. I think the outer fringe of whatever you do, because of coastal squeeze, will always be under attack. But we're also not going to stop maintaining our ports and harbours. So there's a loop here, which is a circular economy loop, which says rather than keep maintaining our ports and harbours and dumping it offshore, reuse that to help buffer the effects of climate change. And also, if we look in the longer term at sea level rise, 1.3 metres we're talking about now by 2100, we have to bring these habitats up with us incrementally to protect us from total loss. So this is a way of helping buffer the effects of incremental sea level rise. It's not a silver bullet, but it's a damn sight better than dumping it in the sea.
Yeah, thanks. And yeah, I mean, that sediment resource model that James pointed out, I mean, that's key because that's the fundamental. I always kind of go back to the natural physics of the estuary and how that's going to change and some of the stuff that Graham's doing with rewrite. I think there is a role for beneficial use in maintaining those sediment budgets and allowing the system to be more resilient. Of course, you do have to understand those drivers, and I think we are able to do that. I think there's also the longer term game is adaptation at the coast, and that's not just environment, it's everything. And I think beneficial use on the seaward side of a structure does provide a certain amount of buffering capacity as well, and a bit of kind of buying time for adaptation whilst you have the slightly harder conversations around how to move, you know, people away from areas of risk. So I think there's a spectrum of options here. Ultimately, my feeling is the most natural system is going to be the most resilient and sustainable for the 7th generation from now. That's my marker.
Yeah, the lady down here, and then we'll come to yourself in the middle.
Hi, Hazel Selly, Senior Specialist in Natural England. My question is for James again, sorry. In terms of sort of reusing dredged sediment and thinking about using it in protected sites like SSSIs, what kind of contaminant thresholds were applied? Because typically you can dispose at sea if it's below action level 2, I believe. But for a more sensitive site like SSSI, you know, would you need to consider like what action levels were applied and what, you know, probably not all of the dredged sediment could actually be used in sensitive sites because of that?
Correct. I can't give you the actual thresholds that were used, but in Chichester, we only used sediment that was already within the cell, which I can't remember the exact thresholds, but it was very heavily scrutinised. And again, this isn't a silver bullet. There's right sediments to use in the right places, and managed realignment has a role to play. Reclamation of saltmarsh has a role to play, as well as hard defences. This is one of a suite. So yes, there's a lot of analysis required to make sure we're not adversely impacting that habitat. We have to balance that with the fact that if we don't do something, we're losing the habitat. And unfortunately, legislation doesn't represent that balance. And in planning terms, we have the obligations for a balanced view for planning applications. We don't seem to have that when we're looking at consenting. And we have to have that balance. By next year, we will have lost, at Itchener alone, 17 times the area of this room. We have to take a balanced view. And that is about engaging and understanding at a macro level what is going on day in, day out, and trying to arrest it. So that there will be a requirement for very careful scrutiny at each and every location. But at the moment, the opposite effect is occurring, where it costs almost nothing to dump it in the sea, pence a cubic metre, and it costs you £60,000 to put 1,000 cubic metres on, to restore a habitat. We have to look at the macro balance.
Yep, lady in the middle, and then the lady there at the back, and then we'll move on.
Thank you. Jo Preston from University of Portsmouth. My question's for Richard. Fantastic talk. We see that habitat suitability models aren't really working for seagrass restoration at the moment. How close do you think we are to understanding the ecophysiological requirements of seagrass, like the environmental envelope within which we know it will thrive, to hopefully improve that site selection?
I think we understand the environmental window fairly well, but we don't have the, I guess, the localized data, environmental data to align it to. And when you're actually doing habitat suitability modeling, even just basic data on depth contours is just poor, unless you're able to fund a high-resolution LiDAR survey. You can't get that level of data. So, you know, trying to apply nutrient data, temperature regimes, all those different components, it becomes really, really problematic. And, we've got quite a good understanding of the light availability, but, whereas like EMODnet has light data, it's all basically deep water, and most of the environmental data we have for the UK is deep water. We've got very poor inshore environmental data, so yeah, we don't 100% know the thresholds of every parameter, but if we had good environmental data, we'd be able to predict to a much higher degree, and we just can't do that at the moment.
Okay. Can I just remind you as well, there is Slido on the go. So if you do want to ask something on Slido, I understand those questions will reach the various speakers. So yeah, and then the lady with the orange top on over there.
Hello, Susan Wilson, Natural England. In all the shoreline management plans, there are a lot of policies of managed realignment, particularly in the second epoch. And so far, a lot of managed realignment has been delivered for habitat compensation. But those policies of managed realignment were put in place and all agreed by all the stakeholders as that's the right thing to do in that location for a sustainable coastline. So how do we get that managed realignment delivered, over and above what's needed for habitat compensation? Because I think it's, quite challenging in terms of costs and things like that. So maybe Rachel.
Yeah, thanks, Susan. And after Peter challenged us on this a bit yesterday, I asked Rach, and she went home and got some numbers for me. That's why I was filling my pockets whilst you're asking that question. So a few stats for you on SMPs along England. They cover 5,518 kilometres of frontage. For managed realignment in Epoch 1, that's 533 kilometres. Epoch 2, you're quite right, Susan, it jumps up to 868, and Epoch 3 is 849. I think that's probably, the coming down is probably, some areas just haven't predicted Epoch 3. In terms of percentages, that's 9.67% Epoch 1, 15.74% Epoch 2, and 15.39% Epoch 3. So they're the numbers we're talking about. And you're quite right, Susan, that, compensation has been the legal driver. That's why I made the point that that's what has kind of got delivery going, and that is what has contributed the large amount of money that's required for these schemes. I think everything that was talked about in terms of the natural capital world and BNG and those opportunities coming in, that has potential with private finance and some of the stuff that Peter mentioned yesterday as well. I think in this transitional time, I think that's why that blended public-private finance model is important, with us supporting and getting the compensatory core, with others coming in for the restoration halo and getting the benefits and investment in that section. But it does come down to cost, and the other point that I made around developing a pipeline with landowner support is a big one, and that really drives a lot of where we go, as well as that ambition of maintaining integrity and coherence to the network. So you can have long frontages in SMPs that are managed realignments, and that's the management intent, but you then need that investment, that funding to deliver the schemes, to invest in all that work, kind of years, decade even, of going from where you might have mapped it to actually having a contractor on site, knocking that hole in the wall, undertaking the managed realignment. That's the critical phase that isn't getting much attention, I think.
So any questions of Amelia or Maria before I select the next person? Is that okay? Yeah. And then, so there's the guy at the back first, and then we'll come to yourself. Yeah.
So yeah, for Amelia, the sandbags didn't work, but I understand obviously with Richard's project they did more. Do you know why did they not work on the south coast, basically?
Yeah, the Solent was very much due to the tide. So we're on the outside of the Beaulieu River along the split, and everything was just washed away. The number of bags that turned up on the reserve just a few miles down was huge. And as I said, we found 2 on the seabed, and even those ones that we did that washed up or we found, they were completely emptied of sediment and the seed. So it's just the current there is just too great. And then in Jennycliff Bay, the majority of the ones that we did find, they really darkened them at the bottom, so potentially just created this anoxic environment which would have just rotted down the seeds very quickly. Poor light would have obviously influenced the germination. So I think there's a variety of issues across the different sites that influenced it, but the main thing is that the bags, we were putting a huge number of bags in, but they weren't able to stabilise themselves. So they were being moved, they just weren't suitable for the restoration sites we had.
Richard, do you want to come in on that at all, and from your experience?
I guess that the way the approach is probably different, so it's not really a direct comparison of what they were doing versus what we were doing. But I guess that where we've done it and we've buried them, that's more successful. But we tend to lay them flat on the seabed or dig them in, and intertidally, we've not been very successful with their use, but subtidally, we've had a lot more success with their use. But I guess it's local environments as well that influence it, and some of the subtleties of some of the mesh sizes and different things like that have big effects.
I think, yeah, I had a question here.
Hi, Emma McGee from the Environment Agency. There's some great examples, and people have talked about the challenges of working within designated sites and within sites that have got protections for all the right reasons. And I know in my experience, perhaps not on the project I presented on, but elsewhere, that triple SI condition assessments, where actually what we know on the ground versus what the condition assessment is telling us, is actually sometimes a bit of a barrier to demonstrating the case for a need for change. Obviously, it goes without saying that we desperately need the funding for the organisations charged with updating and getting around those condition assessments to be in place to deliver those. With that as, goal one, how else do we work with the current data sets and what people, what could be a driver, but actually sometimes is a blocker, to getting in place the steps and the improvements that we need in some of these habitats, where the mismatch between what the paper says the site is at versus what we know on the ground, and if there's any experience of navigating that, that'd be great.
Okay. Anyone like to have a go? Sounds like a ground truthing type question. Yeah. Amelia?
The Bewley, for example, if you asked anyone, they would have said that's a site of a lot of movement. There's sediment movement, there's 2 or 3 different currents moving around, and that's a tricky site to do anything in. So they probably would have said, good luck, that's going to be tricky, and they would have been right. And so, yeah, it's definitely speaking to the locals. It's not just divers, it's people who are using the waterway. They know the site very well, so they would have been knowledgeable, yeah.
A really interesting point there as well. I agree, Amelia, how we value anecdotal evidence is something that always comes up in my mind, because these people that live at the coast do have an awful lot of knowledge. We need to tap into that. I know that from a science perspective, it's sometimes, same with citizen science, there's been that blocker in the past, but that's of interest. But addressing Emma's question, I think we've talked about this in the HCRP with the Leeds bit, and in this improvement project, we have one of the work streams in there is about the monitoring side of things. There are obviously an awful lot of monitoring programs around the place. There's the National and Regional Coastal Monitoring Program. There's the Water Environment Regs Program. There's the Designated Site Mapping or monitoring work that Natural England do. The Natural Capital Ecosystem Assessment Program's been topping that up as well. So I think aligning those as much as possible. I know when I was still in the ReMeMaRe team, I used to talk to Joe Preston an awful lot about this, around how we can standardise methods, and not just data collection, but the data management, those structures, having that right. And so for us in the HCRP, we collect some data for baselining, so that's impact assessment, design, etc. And then we also have planning permission and marine licence conditions. That normally is a couple of years, 3 to 5 years of bespoke monitoring. But we have started talking about how to try and standardise that, again, using standard methods, going into standard databases that already exist, so it's all contributing to the same database. And also, we can't really be burdened with loads of monitoring, because that's not what a statutory requirement is. You have to be proportionate, but I think there is probably a role for us working with a lot of people in this room. I take Steve Colclough's example yesterday about how fish are using sites. If we can standardise just some of the baseline monitoring, because we know where our pipelines are going to be breaching and when. So working with others in universities or wherever, standardise the data we collection in the years prior to the breach. That might be a carbon or whatever, and also in the immediate term afterwards, it might be just we're breaching here on this date. Within the next 6 months, we want to be collecting this fish surveys, and everyone knows that if we've delivered a scheme, that standard data is being collected. We're not doing that long term, but if other people know that and they come along later, then at least they've got kind of that time zero data point. So we're discussing that, but that's kind of work in progress.
Thanks. Maria, I appreciate. Was there anything you'd like to add on that, between maybe disparity between what a map might tell you versus what people tell you?
Yeah, definitely. Ground truth your models and your maps, because like you were saying, Richard, you can carry out hydrodynamic modelling, biophysical modelling, habitat suitability assessments, but getting on the ground, seeing what the sediment type is, chatting to locals, that local knowledge, whether it's sort of fishers, harbour master, like you were saying, Will, that sort of anecdotal, like just in passing, because they are, each location is different, each site is different, and there will be these sort of one-off events as well that, sort of storm surges and that will just change the whole environment as well. So gathering that sort of information and also the historical as well is really informative as well, to really sort of better your understanding and inform that site selection, to then hopefully hopefully you'll then have successful restoration, but then also sharing when things do go a bit pear-shaped as well.
So I'm going to actually draw this to a close now, sorry, but these guys, I presume, are hopefully hanging about for a little bit for lunch. I'm just keen that we don't, I'd have to say, don't spend longer here than we want to. That's really not how that meant to turn out, but that we're all able to get some lunch, have a chat, and draw the conference to a close. So I'll invite Roger back onto the stage, and thank you, everybody.
Wow. Well, that's good. We haven't had a health and safety incident. That's good. Okay, did you see what we did there? Like a seagrass seed in a sealant gun, we injected Will Manning into the habitat compensation program to put the R into the HCP, which is great. So thanks for that, Will. I think, looking forward to working with the more physical coastal geomorph side of things, flood risk management, and seeing whether we can really achieve that halo effect on some of those bigger schemes, because I think there are some significant gains to be had there. And it's quite interesting to note that through the habitat regulations, partly we've created a lot more salt marsh. It may not be the climax community of a salt marsh that perhaps some might want to see, but as Tim McGrath said of Steert, it looks like a salt marsh, it smells like a salt marsh, and actually a lot of the species there think it's a salt marsh too. So some of those sites are actually incredibly important for restoring some of the places that were marshes many, many years ago. So great to hear the progress on that. I just wanted a couple of reflections. Fantastic news about CPN. Congratulations, Amy, and everybody that's been working with Amy over the last few years to get to that point. Great outcome, and really looking forward to working with the network going forward with things like championing coastal coordination. Seascape approach, another great initiative, trying to kind of bring things together in those larger geographic areas. We'll be talking to Joe about how we inject source to sea thinking into the seascape approach as well, because I think there's a bit of a gap there, and we need to kind of expand that, because we need to create those right conditions, as Richard was pointing out with water quality. We can restore all we like, but if we don't get the water quality right, then our chances of success are put at risk. And we've actually got a bit more of an in-depth discussion with Richard and Blue Marine on that very topic coming up in the next couple of weeks. So looking forward to getting down to a bit of nitty-gritty on that one. In terms of future, I mentioned a few of those things yesterday at the start. There's going to be more on benefits. We've got a big injection of support and resources for the natural capital approach and ecosystem assessment program. There's going to be more to talk about and quantifying the benefits that we get from all the benefits we know from all of these different habitats. Training and skills development, including regulators. We need a lot more of that, and we need to enhance the skills. I think that came up earlier today. that analysis and interpretation, you know, the growing people who know and understand, you know, the academic session we had that was more about the latest science on the different habitats. They always go over time, don't they? They've got so much knowledge to kind of express and in so little time. But I would urge you to get involved in the topic groups that have been set up to support those networks of experts so we can enhance that expertise and knowledge. There was a couple of random things. It's, you know, something James Bevan, our former CEO, said to me when I was bemoaning the fact that estuaries and coasts weren't getting as much profile as rivers. He said, well, Roger, if they're aware, they'll care. And Emma brought that out as well in her talk. And that was a really defining moment for me, because I thought, right, 5 conferences later, here we are. You know, we're creating that kind of momentum for people to care about these really important places and the benefits that they can provide to society, not just from our specialist interest in all the biodiversity and everything else. So, you know, we can keep doing that, and we can keep communicating. We need to think of new and novel ways of communicating what we're doing. And it's been great having John Elson here doing a bit of a cartoon interpretation of everything that's been said. So for those speakers today, have a look at what he's created. I haven't had a chance to have a look yet, so I'm sure there'll be some interesting insights. And it's great to have John along with that very non-specialist kind of thinking, and what points has he drawn out, not having any knowledge about what we do. It's really interesting to reflect on that. ReMeMaRe is getting real traction now. I think having 300 of you or so here for the last 2 days is a measure of that, and it's getting into all sorts of places. Internally, my team's got an award for thinking big in the agency, which was quite an achievement for us. You know, it's a 12,000 strong organisation with lots of functions, and we won a category called Thinking Big, which is great. And that means that my chief executive has had to pronounce ReMeMaRe correctly on a video to the whole organisation, and he did, and he's read up on it, and he knew exactly what he was saying. So that was brilliant. So getting the message to high places. So please spread the word about ReMeMaRe, because the more that we get people talking about, particularly with the new government coming in, and there's lots of influencing to be done there, believe you me, having worked with 1 or 2 Secretary of States and trying to raise a profile of what we're doing. Teresa Coffey loved saltmarsh, and that's what led to 3 million WEEF funding in the Water Environment Improvement Fund. It was a long, convoluted way that we got there, but 11 projects being funded this year. Some of which are the beneficial use projects you've heard about. So that kind of influence, it's conversations with people who are met in those decision-making places, really super important, because they can unlock lots of opportunities for us. Let's not catastrophize. I think you've probably all noticed politically things have changed a bit, haven't they? There's a bit of an anti-environment kind of growth in our politics, which is quite worrying, I find. And I think the more we catastrophize about things, the more that feeds that really unhelpful narrative that is coming from some quarters. So Greta Thunberg talked about hope and optimism coming from action. And I think we've had some great examples today of action. Yes, it's not at the capacity we would like yet, but we're getting there. And I think there's real a sense of optimism that comes from seeing what action is being taken in all of these projects. And hope not despair is a big one for me. And if anything, just, you know, what would Joe do? What I mentioned yesterday, Joe was a very positive individual who had a big impact in conservation terms in Northern Ireland. And he certainly didn't catastrophize, and he certainly didn't despair. So just reflect on that, even if you didn't know Joe. It's a really nice way to kind of pick yourself up if you are feeling a bit like things aren't going in the right direction for you. It just leaves me to say probably a few thank yous. And just let me make sure I cover everything off in terms of that, because it's really important. So a big thank you to all of you for coming along to Scarborough. I hope you've enjoyed being at the venue. We certainly looked into the feedback that you gave us from last year, for those of you here last year, and we've made some hopefully notable improvements. I'm afraid we won't be able to change the chairs. As you might imagine, for a venue like this, it's a considerable investment. They were comfy enough, I think, but we did have a bit of feedback on that last year. And hopefully the lunch and the changes we made to all of that has really got more free movement and things like that, and it's allowed us to have more people as well, and it's been great to see you all. Thank you to our organisers. Yes, I act as a bit of an overseer, if you like, but without the two Hannahs, Hannah Westerby and Hannah Ladd, the organisation doesn't happen, and they've been absolutely tremendous in getting us all organised and making this conference happen. So can we have a big round of applause for those two? And Lawrence and Ollie at the back, who have been helping us with sound and visuals and all the rest of it, they've been working away at the back there, trying to make sure everything runs smoothly as well. So a big round of applause for them too. Well done, boys. Our resident artist, John Elson, a big round of applause for John, because it's been quite hard work. I know how concentrated he gets. He gets in his zone and he's just scribbling away, and the speed with which he's doing all of that is fantastic, and it's been great to see all that. And we'd love to have your feedback. So hopefully on your way back on the train or whatever, you'll have been pinged an email with a link. Now, wouldn't it be great if every single one of you gave us some feedback? We got about a third last year, so give it your best shot, and anything we can do to improve on things, we'll try and look into that. And yes, the intention is to come back here next year. 8th to the 10th of July looks like a slot. If we can talk to the venue about whether that's available currently, I might try and get a provisional in before we leave today. So thank you for all your attention, and thank you to all our presenters, sponsors, and everybody else that's helped out with the conference. Thank you.